That's why my first slide says, don't panic. Evidence-based medicine is easy. And I like this message of don't panic because it's the first rule of emergency medicine that I try to teach residents and medical students. Don't panic. All bleeding stops eventually. Nobody bleeds forever. And so here's my disclosure slide, and it's basically I'm a big nerd, and I'm really excited to be able to present evidence-based medicine to the group. I do have a knowledge project called The Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine that involves a 2,000-word blog and a 20-minute podcast that I do every week. We take a recent publication and do a structured critical appraisal tool to probe the literature for its validity. It has no paywall, so it's part of the free open access to medical education movement. And there's about 51,000 subscribers now. The theme is don't believe anything I say, be skeptical, even if you learned it from me. And the ultimate goal is that we want patients to get the best care based on the best evidence. And now, exciting news, you can actually get CME credits for hopefully what you're already doing, listening to the SGEM. I have 3 objectives to get through in today's talk. The first objective is to discuss what is science when we're talking about evidence-based medicine. What is science itself? And then I want to discuss evidence-based medicine, or EBM, and that's going to be the bulk of the conversation. We're going to look at a definition, a little bit of history, and at least one limitation to evidence-based medicine. And then we're going to go through a 5-step critical appraisal tool so you too can actually probe the literature for its validity and be skeptical and be a critical thinker when it comes to evaluating the literature. And I do like quotes, and so there's going to be a few quotes spaced between my slides as some pauses. And this is a really, really good one about being a lifelong learner. So do the best you can do until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And so hopefully after today's presentation, you'll know better how to do critical appraisal and how to be a skeptical consumer of the literature. But to start with, what is science? Well, science is the most reliable method for exploring the natural world. There's some qualities to science that I'd like to go through. One is the burden of proof or the null hypothesis. There's the iterative nature of science, the falsifiability of science, and the fact that science should be proportional. It should be proportional to the evidence and to the claim on whether or not we accept a claim. One thing that science isn't is certain. We get a confidence around a point estimate of an observed effect, but we don't know things for sure. If we knew that, that would be a nirvana fallacy, expecting perfect evidence. And science also doesn't make truth claims. Scientists, though, are human. They do make mistakes. They're flawed and susceptible to cognitive biases. So the first thing is burden of proof in science. It is those who are making the claim have the burden of proof. And it's called a burden, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's hard to prove something, and we should expect that person making the claim to prove their case. And so we start with the null hypothesis. If you're in a legal frame of mind, you're presumed innocent. So the null hypothesis is no superiority. And then evidence is presented to convince us to reject the null and accept that there is superiority. And if the evidence is convincing, and we each will have different levels of evidence required to convince us of a claim, if the evidence is convincing, we should reject the null. If the evidence is not convincing, then we have to, by default, accept the null hypothesis. And it is a logical fallacy to shift that burden of proof onto those who say they don't accept the claim. It is not up to those who don't accept the claim to prove a negative, to prove something doesn't work. It's up to the other individual who's making the claim, who has the burden of proof, to convince them of the claim. And that's a really important distinction in epistemology. And I'll have some examples of that through this talk. I mentioned that science is iterative. And what I mean by iterative is it usually takes steps. Usually it's baby steps forward. Sometimes it's a few steps back, but usually it's baby steps forward. Now, sometimes there are giant leaps that we make, but most of the time it's iterative. It's small incremental changes and we learn. Now, you've probably heard the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants. And if you look at the slide in the bottom left-hand corner, you see Orion. He is a blind giant. And on Orion's shoulder is a servant acting as the giant's eyes. Now, most of us are probably more familiar with the expression in English. If I've seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that was said by Sir Isaac Newton. That's the person in the center of the picture. Now, it was thought that Newton, by saying that, was taking a bit of a dig at Robert Hooke. And Robert Hooke was the first head of the Royal Society of England. And Hooke is there on the right-hand side. Now, Hooke was described as a small man, not very attractive, short, kyphotic, but we actually don't know what Hooke looks like because there's no portraits of Hooke. This picture that you see on the right was made by descriptions of Hooke. Now, all the heads of the Royal Society did have portraits of them, but when the Royal Society moved from one location to another location under the supervision of Newton, who was the head of the Royal Society at the time, somehow Hooke's portrait went missing. Now, we're not sure why it was lost, but it was lost and it wasn't in the move. And Newton and Hooke had a famous rivalry. And so when Newton came out with this statement, if I've seen further, if I've done better, if I've got more advanced, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. It was thought that he was maybe throwing some shade on Robert Hooke, who was short, kyphotic, and didn't help Newton very much. There is a school of thought that believes this is just a rumor and gossip, so I would encourage you to be skeptical. But the bottom line of this slide is that science is iterative. It takes steps. Another aspect of science is that it's falsifiable. If it's not falsifiable, it's considered outside the realm or the dominion of science. Now, this philosophy of science was put forth by Karl Popper in 1934. Not everybody agrees with the falsifiability issue, but when it comes to medical science and the stuff that we're typically doing, falsifiability is a really important aspect of the science we're doing. Now, the person who makes the claim, like I said, has the burden of proof, and it's generally good to avoid comments like all and never in medicine. And the example of that is it only takes one black swan to disprove the claim that all swans are white. And it was at one point thought that all swans were white. Then they went to Australia and found black swans. And so that's all that was required to disprove that all swans are white. So scientific claims need to be falsifiable. Oh, the other thing is science is self-correcting. I've said before that science is the best known method for exploring the natural world, of determining the point estimate of an observed effect size. And because it's iterative and it's falsifiable, it's also self-correcting. Hopefully we learn from science and from our mistakes and our successes. And medical reversal is a thing. What we were doing 50 years ago, hopefully we're not doing today, unless it's the right thing to do. So we know scientists are wrong only because they're right now. So science works. So it's self-correcting. And the final part of science that I wanted to discuss was this idea of proportionality. The evidence required to accept a claim should be proportional to the claim itself. And the classic example of proportionality was given by the famous scientist Carl Sagan, who you may recognize as saying billions and billions of stars. And this was back on his TV series Cosmos. He also wrote a number of books. And in one of the books, he made the claim that there was a fire-breathing dragon that lived in his garage. How much evidence would you need to be proven that to accept the claim that there was a fire-breathing dragon that lived in his garage? Would you take it at Carl Sagan's word? Or from a pretest probability, from a Bayesian aspect, would you go, listen, I've never seen a dragon, let alone a fire-breathing dragon, outside of maybe a movie or a TV show or in a comic book. So I'm going to need a little bit more evidence to accept that you have a fire-breathing dragon in your garage, a higher standard of evidence. And this was compared to a claim of, I have a puppy in my garage. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, would go, okay, Ken, you've got a puppy in your garage. We believe you just on your word alone, because most of you would probably have had an experience seeing a puppy, playing with a puppy, knowing that puppies exist. We have evidence for puppies. So you don't need a great deal of evidence to accept that claim. And this really comes into when we're making medical claims. So if you're making a medical claim that's rather mundane, you know, this medicine will decrease your pain by 10%. Okay, might not need much evidence. The bar isn't that high. The claim isn't that big. But if I said, I have a medicine that cures cancer, you might want a little bit more evidence than maybe somebody's word at it. So to summarize proportionality, Carl Sagan said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And then finally, just talk about the truth. Science does not make a claim about truth. It gives an approximation of the best point estimate of an observed effect size, but it is the best known method we have for exploring the natural world. And science, again, doesn't have any agency, but it's a process. Scientists, though, are flawed individuals, like I said, and we do make mistakes. And I said we because I make mistakes too when I'm conducting science. It's part of the process. So we've talked a lot about sort of philosophical aspects of science. I wanted to give you a real world example of some of the information we've presented so far. And this would be on vitamin C cocktail and sepsis. A few years ago, almost 5 years ago now, because it was in 2016 and here we are in 2021, Merrick, in a paper, made a claim that a before and after study demonstrated that a vitamin C cocktail of steroids, thiamine, and vitamin C could cure sepsis. Could cure sepsis. I mean, that's an extraordinary claim. It was an observational study of 94 patients, 32% absolute decrease in mortality was reported. That gives a number needed to treat to prevent death in sepsis, which is a very heterogeneous disease with a lot of different inputs and points of entry. A number needed to treat of 3 to prevent 1 death. It just sounded too good to be true. So again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, everybody will have a different level of evidence to convince them of something. This was a one-off before and after observational study. There was a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized control trials published in 2019 looking at critical ill patients, not just sepsis patients, but there were septic patients in there. No statistical difference in mortality. Fuji et al. In JAMA, the vitamins trial, was a randomized control trial of just over 200 patients. No statistical mortality benefit was demonstrated. And then the latest trial in JAMA had a population of just over 200 patients, randomized control trial, no difference in SOFA scores at 72 hours. So I ask you, has the burden of proof been met? Should we reject the null hypothesis? Should we accept a claim that a vitamin C cocktail can cure sepsis based on an observational study, before and after study, and when we have randomized control trials that do not demonstrate superiority for their primary outcome. I'm not ready to accept the claim that vitamin C cures sepsis. I wish it did, but at this point, I don't claim it doesn't. I'm just not convinced that it does. So again, I said I liked quotes. So science is the acceptance of what works and the rejection of what does not, and that needs more courage than we may think. It is difficult. Science is hard, and it does take courage to accept what works, but maybe even more difficult to reject what does not. And in healthcare, it's been said that starting a new medication, it's like falling in love, getting married, the honeymoon. But stopping a medication, stopping a practice is like an ugly divorce. So we've talked about science, and important part of science is evidence-based medicine. And we're going to talk about evidence-based medicine now for the bulk of the rest of the talk. And so to know what I'm saying when I use the term EBM, here's the definition that I use. It's the conscientious, judicious use of the current best evidence in making decisions about individual patient care. And you need to be explicit about it. And so this was put forth by Dave Sackett. And there's his definition: the conscientious, explicit, judicious, best evidence. Now I added the term shared, the word shared in there, because I like to make shared decisions with patients about the care of individual patients. And each word is really important because it highlights something. We need to be conscientious. We need to be thinking. We need to be explicit about what we're doing. We still need to use our good clinical judgment and look for the best evidence, not just the evidence that confirms our biases or what we want to be true. And then again, sharing the decision with the patient. And we treat an N of 1. We don't treat a population, unless you're in public health maybe, but we treat a population of 1. So it's that individual patient care. And this can be represented in a Venn diagram. And so in this Venn diagram, the literature is blue. And the literature should inform our care, but you can see it's only one of 3 components of evidence-based medicine. And many people make the mistake of thinking that evidence-based medicine is just about the scientific literature. And that is really important, and we need to know what the scientific literature is and how to critically appraise it. But it's only one of 3 components. And so that literature should inform our care, should guide our care, but should not dictate our care. Now, the green circle is your good clinical judgment, and you need to use that. And sometimes we'll have vast clinical judgment where you'll have spent years seeing certain conditions, certain diseases, certain injuries, and you bring that institutional knowledge to the table. But sometimes you won't have really much experience at all because you're new or because it's a rare condition. And then the red circle is to ask the patient what they value and prefer. And the easiest way to find out what patients' values and preferences are, and I'm just spitballing here, ask them, what do you value? What do you want? What do you prefer? Because they still have agency and autonomy over their own healthcare. Regardless, if you have a protocol that says you need a 2-hour delta trope, the patient with chest pain may say, I understand that, but I have some other things I need to do. I have groceries that are, ice cream melting in the car. I have a dog that I have to get back to. What do they value? And if they have the information, they're allowed to make decisions that we don't necessarily agree with. There's a hierarchy to evidence, and we want to use the best evidence as defined in evidence-based medicine. Now, that is usually described as a beautiful symmetrical pyramid. I use this picture instead of these stacks of rocks that have pits and defects, and they're asymmetrical and they're flawed, just like we are. And there's different levels. And so here are the levels of evidence, and it starts with expert opinion at the bottom, which is a form of evidence-based medicine. Expert opinion is important, and it can be true. It may not be true as well, but we should look for the best evidence. And we know that randomized control trials eliminate some of the cognitive biases that we have as expert opinion, as case reports. That middle, that randomized control trial, is not the highest. The top is considered a systematic review. A systematic review is considered the highest level of evidence. Now, there is one higher level, and that's a double-blinded, placebo-controlled crossover trial with an N of 1. And that's because we treat one patient at a time. We don't treat populations usually. We treat one at a time. But before I get any feedback in the chat, because I don't have the chat up on my screen, I'm waiting for someone to say, hey, systematic reviews, come on, the highest form of evidence, what are you talking about? Well, there is an issue with systematic reviews. In fact, there's an issue with all of the levels of evidence. They all have threats and limitations. And it doesn't necessarily mean the methodology is incorrect. So you can have, like I said, a case report that is actually true with regards to external validity to a larger population, but it may not, and we can get higher levels of evidence. But from a systematic review, here's what you have to be careful of. GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And it means if you throw together a whole bunch of crappy little studies, probably observational studies, mash them all up into a meat grinder, crank out a point estimate to the 5th decimal point, it gives you some impressive p-value, and it claims that certainty exists when certainty does not exist, based on a whole bunch of small little observational studies. To describe this, I talk about growing up on a farm, and my mom made the best apple pies, and I'm sorry, that's a hill I'm gonna die on. So if anybody's listening there and they have a mom who makes them apple pies, fine, but my mom makes me the best apple pies. And this is because she used wonderful apples, crisp in the fall, ready to go, very dark, unrefined sugar, threw in some cinnamon, and that secret ingredient, love, right? And so if you take all those wonderful ingredients and put them into an apple pie, if you add what is called a cow pie, and that is the picture on the left, a cow pie is a large poop that comes out of the back of a cow, lands on the ground, and it's about the size of a pie. If you add that ingredient to all the wonderful ingredients of an apple pie, all you get is a poop emoji. So the quality of the ingredients that go into a systematic review are so important. You've got to look at the primary studies. And if the primary studies have a high risk of bias, they're observational studies, that you can get this mathematical model that makes it look like it's really certain when certainty certainly doesn't exist. So we got to watch for that. And then of course, bias. And there are all these potential biases that can be introduced into studies. And when I use the term bias, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about something that is random. It's not random noise. It's like this sailboat analogy. The truth is in front of us. That's the direction we want to go to. That's our destination. We want to get as close to the truth as possible. But it's bias that systematically moves us away from the truth. And it's not the waves that are going this way and that way and the turbulence within the water. It is the wind that is blowing us off course. And I got this sailboat analogy from my good friend, Dr. Anthony Crocco. And he described bias as a strong wind while on a sailboat, pushing us away from the truth, pushing us off course. And remember, there is no such thing as truth. There's just the best point estimate of an observed effect size with a confidence interval around that. Now, there are some arguments against evidence-based medicine. I'm just going to go through one of them. And the one that always comes up is harm. You can't do a randomized control trial on harm. Ethics won't approve of it. If you say, I've got a treatment and it's going to harm people, well, ethics would say you can't do that, or the placebo group would put the patient in significant harm's way. And the example people give is the parachute analogy. It would be unethical to randomize people into a sham parachute, a backpack, and have them jump out of a plane to see if parachutes prevent gravitational injuries, i.e. mortality and morbidity. And in 2003, Smith and Bell published a systematic review on this topic. Now, they had their tongue firmly in their cheek. They wanted to look at it, whether parachute use prevents death or major trauma related to gravitational challenges. They searched the world's literature, but couldn't find any randomized control trials on this. Surprising. But there were case reports of people falling out of a plane without a parachute and surviving. So a case report, you don't need a parachute. There was other case reports of people using a parachute and getting an iatrogenic injury, even though the parachute worked. And so they said, we do not have definitive evidence that people should wear parachutes when jumping out of an airplane. So they suggested doing a randomized control trial of taking people that really were EBM advocates and flying them up into an aircraft and randomizing them in a blind fashion to either a parachute or a backpack, and then they would jump out of the plane. And then they would take all the survivors to make it a more robust study and fly them back up into the plane and do a crossover trial. So if you were in the parachute group on the first jump, you would be randomized to the other group, the backpack group, and then jump. And they said, then we will have definitive evidence that parachutes prevent major trauma and death related to gravitational challenges. Now, of course, they had significant problems recruiting anybody into that kind of randomized control trial. However, Hayes et al. In the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2018 said, you know what? Most medical practices are not gravitational or parachute related issues. I mean, we have significant evidence about gravity. We may not understand anything about gravity, but you know what? It was a hypothesis that gravity worked. It became a theory, much stronger evidence. And now we have the law of gravity. And the law of gravity, it is descriptive, not prescriptive. So it describes what we're observing, but it's considered a law. We don't have a law when it comes to, does epinephrine provide a patient-oriented outcome for patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, right? There's equipoise there, as opposed to, I wonder if jumping out of the third floor of an apartment building is a good idea. Now, just so you know, somebody did go ahead and conduct a randomized control trial on parachutes. This was published in 2018, and this was by Ye et al., published in the BMJ. They approached 92 passengers of an aircraft. 18 years of age and older were screened. 23 people agreed to be randomized into a backpack or a parachute and jump out of an aircraft. Their primary outcome was a composite of death or major traumatic injury. And their key result was parachutes did not reduce death or major injury. It was 0% in both groups with an impressive p-value of greater than 0.9. How did that happen? How did you have a group of people jumping out of a plane with either a backpack or a parachute and nobody was hurt? And it's because of that picture. And that's one of the investigators there jumping out of a plane with a backpack on. It's because there was a difference between those who participated in the studies and those who didn't. Those who participated and agreed to do the study was conducted on a plane that was at rest, traveling 0 kilometers an hour, and the average height was 0.6 meters. That was the jump. Those who did not agree to be in the study had an average height of something like 9 kilometers up, going 800 kilometers an hour. So you need to know the details. You need to be skeptical about what you're reading. So this is how I feel about evidence-based medicine. It's the worst form of medicine, except all others that have been tried. Okay, so let's go through a 5-step critical appraisal for exploring the literature, probing the literature, looking at the literature for its validity. And so those 5 steps include, step 1 is formulating a question based on a PICO format. And then you have to have a search strategy to find the evidence. And then you want to evaluate it for, is it the least biased evidence? And that's that pyramid. And then go through a checklist to probe the literature for its validity. And then sit back and reflect and say, is this going to change my practice? Does this validate my practice? How do I incorporate this study into the overall literature arc? And once you've done that, you can discuss it with your patient and apply your clinical judgment and ask them about their values and preferences. So the first thing is the PICO: population, intervention, control, and outcome. So the first step is that PICO population. Let's say you have a 72-year-old woman with an acute ischemic stroke. You want to know, does TPA work? So if you're going to ask that question, you need to find a paper that has a study population that includes women over the age of 65, right? So it captures that 72-year-old woman with acute ischemic stroke. What was the specific intervention? And in this case, we're looking at TPA for acute ischemic stroke. Hopefully you find one that uses TPA, so you don't have to worry about external validity of using a different lytic for stroke. And then what was the comparison? Did they compare it to usual care? Was it compared to a blinded placebo? So just usual care, if you know you're in the treatment group, that's different than going, we injected a placebo versus injecting the active treatment. So did they have a sham or control group, or did they just compare it to usual care? And then what was the outcome? And again, I grew up on a farm, so I like this cow picture. But what was the primary outcome? Was it patient-oriented? What the patient cared about? Good neurologic function? We often see DO's, that's disease-oriented outcomes. Or maybe LO's, we get lab values, lab-oriented outcome, like what was their lactate level? What was their hemoglobin level? Things like that. We want to see patient-oriented outcome. Now I am trying to coin a new term, and that's a MOO, a monitor-oriented outcome. And as an example, let's say you have a trauma patient who's hypotensive, and so you're going to give them a fluid bolus before you start, triggering your massive transfusion protocol. And you say, well, do we give this fluid, that fluid, what type of fluid, how much fluid? And their outcome is, what was the blood pressure? And if the blood pressure was statistically higher by like 3 millimeters of mercury for systolic blood pressure because of the bolus you gave, and yet ultimately the patients in both groups died at the same rate, that's really not a great outcome. We want a patient-oriented outcome, not some monitor-oriented outcome. The next step, step 2, is the search strategy. You need to find the best evidence, right? You need to find the evidence to begin with. So if you type in, and this is what I did last night when preparing for this talk, TPA for acute ischemic stroke into Dr. Google, you got over 500,000 hits. You're not going to be able to get through those efficiently. If you go to Google Scholar, you get 42,000 hits for using TPA for acute ischemic stroke. Okay, how about PubMed? 2,000 hits. Those are the search strategies on the left. I'm going to suggest maybe using a search strategy on the right. There's one called TRIP database that stands for turning research into practice. So it's translational. It takes higher forms of evidence, some randomized control trials and above on that pyramid. So looking at guidelines, systematic reviews, consensus statements. And if you type in TPA for acute ischemic stroke, you still get 823. So that's a lot of reading to do, but you can click on, how about Canadian? Because we're in this context, we're in the Canadian health system. What does Canadian organizations think about how we should treat Canadians for acute ischemic stroke with TPA? And there were 7. That's digestible. The Cochrane database of systematic reviews, that's that middle picture on the right-hand side. There were 9 listed with the search strategy of TPA for acute ischemic stroke. And the most recent one, looking at just lytics for acute ischemic stroke, was by Wardlaw et al. In 2014. And then if you're an uber nerd, me, uber nerd, you go to clinicaltrials.gov. And that way you can see registered trials that have been published or that haven't been published that are actively recruiting, or things that have been concluded and the results are published, but they haven't had a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. And so clinicaltrials.gov is a great way to go if you want to dive in and be uber nerdy. But, TRIP database and Cochrane database of systematic reviews is excellent. And then you want to find the least biased or the highest form of evidence. And so this is that perfect pyramid. Remember, I like those stack of stones better. And so at the bottom, you see a picture of me, and that would be expert opinion. In my opinion, it doesn't make my opinion right or wrong, but there are higher levels of evidence than just what Ken says. You can get up to randomized control trials. You can get up to those systematic reviews and meta-analyses, those Cochrane reviews that are usually very, very high quality. And then you do a quality checklist, and there are various checklists available. And I've got one linked at the bottom there. That's the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine.net. That's in Oxford, England. And they have a whole bunch of different checklists for randomized control trials, observational trials, systematic reviews, clinical decision instruments, those types of things. And they range from as many as 11 questions to as few as 6 questions. And you go through, like for randomized control trials, and say, are these emergency medicine patients? Were they adequately randomized? Was everyone treated equally except for the randomization? Did they do an intention to treat analysis? Check, 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 check. And the answers are yes, no, or I don't know based on the information that was provided in the manuscript. And how you get really good at critical appraisal? 3 ways. First way is practice. The second way is practice. And the third way is practice. And you've got to be practicing the correct way. So practice, practice, practice to be good at critical appraisal. I just want to pull out a couple items from that checklist. And one is on randomization. Randomization is such a powerful tool to minimize bias. It doesn't eliminate all biases, but it's a way to limit and minimize bias. And you want to know, did they conceal the randomization so nobody knew which group they were in? And was it adequate? Was blinding maintained? Which type of randomization did they use? Did they use block, cluster, 1-to-1, 2-to-1, things like that? And I like using this example of randomization because this is the first paper I could find on randomization or allocation bias. So people were blinded to, people were randomized, but they weren't blinded to what group they were in. The picture on the left is the paper that was published by Alexander Hamilton, a medical student from Scotland. And this was from 1809 when he was in the military and he was taking part in the Peninsula War. And at the time, the standard of care, the best care, it's what all the cool doctors were doing, was on the right-hand side. That's bloodletting. And if you had one of your humors was off, and in this case, soldiers were coming in with camp fever, so what we would describe probably as sepsis, the treatment was to lance the antecubital fossa and let the blood drain out of them. And just so people don't get the wrong idea, that is not the standard of care now. We do not remove blood from septic patients. We usually add volume, and in particular, sometimes blood, but it's not to remove volume and remove blood. But that was the standard of care. So all the bias in this randomized study should have been towards bloodletting, even though it wasn't blinded. Because the observational studies, you could rationalize why somebody didn't get better with bloodletting. You didn't bleed them early enough. You didn't take off enough blood. You didn't bleed them from their dominant arm. You didn't bleed them soon enough in a certain fashion. So all these rationalizations, and until they did a randomized control trial. So here's the 2-by-2 table from over 200 years ago. Bloodletting versus no bloodletting. They did a 2-to-1 randomization where 2 patients had no bloodletting and 1 soldier was bloodletted, the standard of care. And they had very objective primary outcome, alive or dead. Look at that. Which group would you like to be in? If you had bloodletting done, 29%, almost a third of soldiers died. If you were in the no bloodletting group, the radical idea, 3% died. So that gives you a number needed to harm, and in this case, death, of 4. So this is why randomization is so important, to be able to get over those observational studies, the recall bias that we have. Oh, the patients I saw all did well, or if they didn't do well, we forget them or rationalize them away. The one other aspect of randomized control trials that are so important is that of blinding. And so a high quality randomized control trial includes blinding. And this is the story I use to illustrate the importance of blinding, because this is where we get the term blinding from. It was this study conducted 200 years ago. So on the left, you see a picture of a beautiful woman. That is Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette was a patron of the doctor in the middle. That is Dr. Mesmer. Dr. Franz Mesmer was a famous German physician, and he believed in animal magnetism, which was very popular back then. Magnets were just being discovered and the properties were being explored. And he felt that you could cure disease and illness and various ailments by magnets, by placing magnets with patients. And so Marie Antoinette was a big patron of Dr. Mesmer, spent a lot of time with him in France when he moved to France. He became so popular, he had to have these big banquet tables where they would put a big bowl of magnets in the center of the table, and people would hold on to these rods, these metallic rods with wires traveling to the center of the table. And in this banquet bowl, they would have these magnets. Now, King Louis XVI was not happy with Marie Antoinette spending so much time with Dr. Mesmer, both time and money. So he put together a royal commission and had the American scientist Benjamin Franklin, which is the picture on the right. And Benjamin Franklin came over, joined a royal commission, and started doing some experiments. And what they did was they had the intervention, that was the magnets, either present or not present for the treatment, but they blindfolded patients. So the patients didn't know, that was a single blinded study, whether or not the intervention was there. So they literally blindfolded patients. And it was a single blinded study. And what they found with the results were when patients didn't know whether magnets were present or not, it highlighted the importance of blinding because they found no difference in the outcome, whether magnets were present or not. And so the conclusion was, and you know this story, you know Dr. Mesmer, you know this, patients were just being mesmerized. And so blinding is so important. You can blind the patient, you can blind the clinician who's doing the study, and the outcome assessor. So that would be triple blinded. And it's really important. We're seeing this with, I'm seeing studies that look at taking those little isopropyl alcohol wipes, and they say, okay, well, let's compare that, the isopropyl alcohol wipe, to a saline wipe for treating nausea in the emergency department. And people are randomized into one group or the other. Do you think people can tell the smell of alcohol compared to the smell of saline? That ethyl propyl alcohol has a very medicinal smell to it. And you would know, oh, I must be in the treatment group. So even though they blind it and make the little packets look the same, it's easy to conclude that it was an unblinded trial. And we know that the placebo effect is powerful. And if you've got a subjective outcome like nausea, you could say that it's not an effect of the isopropyl alcohol, but an elaborate placebo effect, knowing that the patient was in the active group. And then the fifth thing, the final thing, practice changing or not. Look at the evidence, critically appraise it, consider the limitations. Then you'll have to decide, does this affirm my practice? Does this refute my practice? Do I not know still? How does it take place in the context of what existing literature has? And then be skeptical of that and think in terms of maybe the number needed to treat or the number needed to harm, and then use that as a communication tool with the patients to get what they want and what they desire and what they value. Now, there is a problem with all this because this is called the leaky pipe. And we know that there are leaks in knowledge translation. And it's been quantified that it can take over 10 years for high quality, clinically relevant information, that's the stuff at the top of that slide, to go all the way through. There's these leaks this way, these leaks that way. 17 years is the specific number, but it's probably just more than 10 years for high quality, clinically relevant information to reach the patient's bedside. Now, I think that's a really long time. I've been in practice for 23 years now. So stuff I learned 17 years now are coming online as common practice. That's a really long time. So here's a quote. I really like this from Marie Curie. And she said, I was taught that the way of progress was neither swift nor easy, Well, hopefully by talking about the burden of proof and the progression of science and the iterative nature, I've demonstrated that it's not easy, but also it's not swift. There are 7 leaks in that knowledge translation pipeline. The first 5 are actually on the clinician side, and the last 2 are on the patient side. And I really like highlighting women in science. Marie Curie was a rock star. I mean, she was a female STEM superhero. Do you know that she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize? Oh, yeah. And she won it how many times? Twice. Twice. Now, there have been other people that have won the Nobel Prize twice, but she's the only human being to ever win the Nobel Prize in 2 different sciences. So pretty amazing. But you know what? I think that in the age of social media, we should be able to speed up that knowledge translation. We should be able to cut that KT window down from over 10 years to less than 1 year. Never in human history have we had access to so much medical information. But the problem is the signal to noise ratio, right? It's hard to stay up on the literature. How can you possibly do that? There are more than 4,000 medical publications every day in PubMed. And this was before COVID. 75 randomized control trials published every day, a dozen systematic reviews. Go home tonight, you're 75 randomized control trials behind and a dozen systematic reviews behind. Are you keeping up on the literature? And now with COVID times, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's been coined the infodemic. There are more than 200 articles just on COVID in the PubMed and the pre-PubMed literature. And if you look at the traditional media with COVID, in the first 5 months of 2020, there were 39 million individual articles published. That was only in English language. What about French language outlets too? 1.1 million of those 39 million were considered misinformation. And don't even get me started on tweets and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. It is absolutely exhausting trying to drink from the COVID infodemic fire hose. But I have a solution. I think foam. Well, don't just drink beer, but well, if you like beer, have a beer, but just in moderation. But this is why I like foam, free open access to medical education, because it can filter the information for you. The good stuff can bubble up to the top. And FOAMED was started by some Australians over a pint of beer back in a pub in Dublin in 2012. And it's not a teaching philosophy or a strategy, but it's rather a global, accessible, crowdsourced, asynchronous adjunct to traditional education. So it's supposed to be augmenting it. And it's for anyone, anywhere, at any time. Foam is the concept that we're trying to promote. And Steve Jobs was really good at this, about saying, let's think differently. And FOAMED is turning medical education on its head, trying to make us think differently. And ultimately, this is a little emoji of me, to make the world a better place so patients get the best care based on the best evidence. And to bring it back to maybe McGill University and William Osler, I like to think of FOAMED as the 21st century version of the Journal Club. Sir William Osler was ahead of his time back in 1875 when he first organized the very first Journal Club at McGill University. And he said that why he was doing this, it was for the purchase and distribution of periodicals that we could ill afford to subscribe to. And remember, FOAMED is free, open access. And we believe that we should share our intellectual capital with the world so patients get the best care based on the best evidence with no paywall. So it's like a virtual journal club. And that's what I'm trying to do with my knowledge translation project, The Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. Each week I do a structured critical review of a recent publication, trying to cut that KT window down from over 10 years to less than 1 year using the power of social media. So to finish, I like quotes. You know I like quotes. I peppered this talk with quotes. I started with a fantastic quote about doing better. Well, I want to end with a really great quote, especially during COVID times. And Dr. Gillian Horton said, be brave, be kind, be funny, because humor shines a powerful light on hypocrisy and absurdity while reminding us we are tough and still alive. These are tough times. These are challenging times, character revealing times, and we can get through this, but we'll need to be brave. We need to be kind to each other, and we can't lose our sense of humor because it reminds us that we're humans. So the take-home message, 3. First one is don't panic. Title of the talk, evidence-based medicine and critical appraisal. It gets easier with practice. Just practice, practice, practice. And if you haven't picked up on my enthusiasm for evidence-based medicine, that I haven't done my job presenting, because I think evidence-based medicine rocks. Once you get a real taste of this type of practice, it's hard to go back to other forms of medical practice like magnetism, unblinded studies, bloodletting. But remember that the literature informs our care, it guides our care, but we still need to use our clinical judgment and talk to our patients about their preferences. And of course, the final take-home message is be skeptical, even of me. It doesn't mean that your minds are closed, but rather that your minds are open, just not so open your brain falls out. The time to believe something is when you have good evidence to accept the claim. Thank you very much. And